The police received reports of a little girl sleeping on the street in front of a funeral home. When an officer approached her, he began to cry upon discovering why. Night had fallen over the neighborhood with an unsettling calm. Streetlights flickered weakly, casting long shadows across sidewalks still damp from a recent rain. The clock tower struck 3 in the morning, a time when most residents slept soundly, unaware of what was quietly unfolding at the funeral home at the end of the street. Inside the station, Officer Richard Brown was meticulously reviewing some documents when the phone rang. With a sigh, he set aside his papers and picked up the call. The voice on the other end sounded tense, almost trembling. "Officer Brown, we need you to check on a situation at the Martinez funeral home. There's a little girl sleeping at the door. We don't know what to do," explained the operator before hanging up. Richard looked at his partner, Julian, who was already standing and adjusting his badge, a worried expression on his face. "Looks like we're in for a busy night," Richard remarked, closing his files. Julian nodded, and both officers hurried toward their patrol cars. The drive to the funeral home was silent, interrupted only by distant traffic sounds and the echo of their footsteps on the wet pavement. Upon arriving, a dim yellow street lamp cast a faint glow over the funeral home's entrance. Richard and Julian approached cautiously, surveying the scene. The door was slightly ajar, revealing a softly lit interior. On the sidewalk, a small figure lay curled up on the ground, wrapped in a tattered blanket. "Hi there, little one," Richard greeted gently, kneeling down to Luna, the girl they were trying to comfort. Luna looked up, her big, fearful eyes reflecting both the darkness of the night and a profound sadness. "I don't want to leave my mommy alone," she murmured in a shaky voice, clutching the blanket as if it were her only shield. Richard felt a lump form in his throat. He vividly remembered his own childhood and the void left by losing his mother years ago. He struggled to maintain his composure, knowing that any hint of vulnerability might heighten the girl's fear. "We're here to help you, Luna. You're not alone," he said softly, hoping to reassure her. Julian stood nearby, sensing the tension gripping his partner. The air was thick with mingled fear, sorrow, and the urgent need for comfort. Richard extended a hand toward Luna. She eyed it warily before finally taking it. The cold night air contrasted with the warmth of their contact, forming a small bridge of humanity in the darkness. "Where is your mum?" Richard asked, trying to understand the situation better. Luna lowered her gaze, nervously fidgeting with the edges of the blanket. "She's inside, in the funeral home. She died today," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Richard's heart tightened. The mention of death and the fear of isolation struck a deep chord within him. He remembered confronting such loss himself, the sense of abandonment and the struggle to find solace amid immense grief. "I'm so sorry, Luna. This must be so hard for you," he said, unable to hide the emotion building inside him. Tears threatened to well up in his eyes, but Richard forced himself to stay calm. He knew that showing too much distress could undermine Luna's trust in him. "We'll make sure you're safe and that your mom rests in peace. You don't have to face this alone," he continued, trying to instill hope in the young girl. Julian stepped forward, offering a gentle smile. "We'll take you somewhere safe and talk to someone who can help. Does that sound okay?" he asked, lightening the mood as best he could. Luna nodded slowly, still frightened, but visibly relieved to have the officer's support. Richard felt a swell of emotion inside, but stayed resolute for her sake. As they helped Luna to her feet, Richard's gaze drifted momentarily into the darkness, recalling the pain of his own past loss. It was an experience that had left him deeply scarred, yet had shaped him into the empathetic and dedicated man he was now. "Come on, Luna," he said, guiding her toward the funeral home entrance. "We'll take you somewhere you can be safe." Cautiously, Luna followed him. Richard and Julian stepped into the quiet building, illuminated only by a few dim lights. Inside were display cases of flowers and coffins, a solemn reflection of the place. Luna regarded everything with hollow sadness, still clutching the blanket that shielded her from the cold. Richard paused for a moment, watching Luna struggle with her grief. In that instant, he realized the gravity of her situation. Not only was she a child with nowhere to go, but now also a daughter left alone to deal with her mother's death with no support at all. "Don't worry, Luna. We'll figure this out together," he assured her, finally letting the tears he'd been holding back slip free. Sensing Richard's inner turmoil, Julian placed a reassuring hand on his partner's shoulder. "It's okay, Richard. We'll do what's right," he stated firmly. Richard nodded, hurriedly wiping his tears before turning to the door again. "Let's head to the station and talk to someone who can help both you and your mom," he suggested, determined not to leave Luna alone in her time of greatest need. As they exited the funeral home, the night seemed a little less dark, illuminated by the empathy and resolve Richard had shown this small child. In those first few minutes, a bond formed that would be the beginning of a story about compassion, loss, and ultimately, hope. Richard knew the road ahead would be difficult, not only facing the bureaucracy and the funeral home's debts, but also wrestling with his own inner demons. Yet in that moment, all that mattered was being there for Luna, offering the comfort and security she so desperately needed. The moon glowed brightly above, silently observing the small act of humanity taking place beneath its silver light. And so, under that glow, Richard and Julian began their mission to help a young girl who just wanted to avoid leaving her mother alone in the darkness of the night. The following morning dawned with a grayish sky, adding to the already somber atmosphere of Martinez Funeral Home. The building, located at the end of the main street, bore obvious signs of neglect: grimy windows, peeling paint, and a wooden door that creaked with each gust of wind. Inside, Mrs. Margaret, the funeral home's owner, waited anxiously, repeatedly checking her phone with a worried expression etched onto her face. Richard and Julian arrived right on time, accompanied by Luna, who still showed signs of emotional exhaustion. Entering, they were met by Mrs. Margaret, a middle-aged woman whose features were lined with fatigue and whose eyes reflected a blend of sadness and determination. "Good morning," Richard greeted, offering a sympathetic smile. "I'm Officer Brown, and this is my partner Julian. We're here to help Luna and her mother." Mrs. Margaret nodded, inviting them to sit in a modest but clean reception area. The walls were adorned with photographs of past services, solemn farewells held with dignity and respect. Even so, the room was heavy with a palpable tension. "Thank you for coming so quickly," Mrs. Margaret began, her voice trembling slightly. "I know this is difficult for all of us." Richard noticed her hands shaking as she held her cup of coffee. He decided it was time to gently address the main issue. "Mrs. Margaret, we need to understand more about Sophia's situation so we can help. Could you tell us a bit about what's going on?" Mrs. Margaret exhaled a long, deep sigh before continuing, her eyes momentarily dropping as she searched for the right words. "The truth is, we don't have enough resources to cover Sophia's funeral," she admitted. "We've been operating on very thin margins. Recently, the bank gave us an ultimatum. If we can't pay off the debt in the coming months, they'll repossess the funeral home." Richard felt a pang in his chest. The financial pressure Mrs. Margaret faced threatened not only to close the business, but also to rob Luna of a dignified farewell for her mother. "I see," he responded, his empathy evident. "Did Sophia have any insurance or savings to cover burial expenses?" Mrs. Margaret shook her head, her somber expression mirroring the painful reality. "No, unfortunately not. She didn't have life insurance or any significant savings. After we handled her father's funeral last year, every bit of our earnings went toward those costs. We've been struggling to stay afloat ever since." Richard nodded, fully grasping the severity of the situation. Without intervention, Luna and Mrs. Margaret would remain trapped in a hopeless cycle. "Is there any way we can help? Maybe through the station or by finding community support," he suggested, searching for a viable solution. Mrs. Margaret looked up, her eyes brimming with both gratitude and desperation. I've tried everything, but the debts are overwhelming. The bank insists on a monthly payment we just can't afford with our current income. Every funeral we handle seems to take us one step closer to the edge. Julian chimed in, trying to offer a practical approach. Maybe we could organize a fundraiser or solicit donations to cover the immediate funeral expenses. We could also look into financing options or some form of government assistance. Mrs. Margaret nodded slowly, weighing the possibilities. I've heard rumors about certain organizations that help in situations like this, but I've never had the time or resources to really look into them. If you could help, it would be a true blessing. Richard exchanged a glance with Julian, who nodded in agreement. They knew prompt assistance was crucial if Luna was to have a proper chance to say goodbye to her mother. We'll do everything we can, Richard assured her. First, we'll coordinate with Lily Morales, our social worker, to see what kind of aid we can arrange. Then we'll organize a community drive to gather the funds we need. Mrs. Margaret let out a sigh of relief, the faintest smile appearing on her tired face. Thank you. I really appreciate your support. I don't know what we'd do without you. Richard decided it was time to take a closer look around the funeral home. He asked Mrs. Margaret to show them the rest of the facility, hoping to pinpoint ways to optimize resources or find creative solutions. As they toured the premises, Richard observed the shortcomings Mrs. Margaret had mentioned. The furnishings were simple and functional, but evidently worn from constant use and a lack of investment. The shelves were stocked with coffins and urns, yet there was a conspicuous absence of fresh flowers or other items that might offer a warmer, more comforting ambiance for services. Mrs. Margaret, have you considered diversifying your services to increase revenue? Perhaps offering additional support options or partnering with local suppliers? Richard suggested, treading carefully. Mrs. Margaret furrowed her brow, thinking it over. I've tried some things, but something always seems to get in the way of growth. Competition is tough, and with debts piling up, it's hard to think long-term when I'm barely managing day-to-day. Richard understood that the situation was more complicated than it looked. The debts weren't just undermining the funeral home's operations, they were also preventing Mrs. Margaret from providing the compassionate, dignified services people like Luna and her mother needed. Is there any possibility of renegotiating the debt with the bank? Maybe we could help set up a meeting to discuss more flexible options, Richard suggested, recalling that the police station maintained contacts at various financial institutions. Mrs. Margaret nodded slowly, visibly relieved by the suggestion. That would be ideal. If we could just get some extra time, maybe we could find a more sustainable solution. I don't want to shut down this funeral home, not just for myself, but for all the families who depend on us in their most difficult moments. Richard felt a renewed sense of determination. He knew that every small effort mattered, and that with the right support, they could pull through. Deciding that the first steps would be to contact Lily Morales, the social worker, and organize a meeting with the bank as soon as possible, he spoke up. Mrs. Margaret, we'll do everything in our power to help. You're not alone in this, he assured, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. She smiled back, though the shadow of worry still lingered. Thank you, Richard. It means so much to me, and to Luna. Stepping out of the funeral home, Richard and Julian paused to breathe in the fresh air. Though the sun's light now filled the street, it hadn't quite dispelled the darkness of the previous night, and their concerns weighed heavily. This is only the beginning, Julian remarked. We have a lot of work ahead of us. Richard nodded, glancing back at the funeral home with a blend of resolve and empathy. Yes, but we won't do it alone. The community can be more supportive than we think, and we'll make sure Luna and Mrs. Margaret don't end up stranded. As they walked away, Richard couldn't help reflecting on life's fragility and how, in times of crisis, a community's true nature comes to light. Mrs. Margaret and Luna's predicament wasn't just about debts and bureaucracy. It was a stark reminder of the importance of compassion and mutual support. With renewed commitment, Richard knew they faced a tough path ahead, but also an opportunity to make a real difference. As the sun rose higher, little by little brightening the city, He and Julian braced themselves for whatever lay in store, determined not to let the previous night's darkness shape the future of those relying on them. A tense morning at the police station. Morning stretched on slowly as Richard Brown and Julian accompanied Luna to the station. The heavy atmosphere from the night before still clung in the air, as though the first rays of sunlight had failed to wash away the sorrow and worry surrounding the little girl. Luna, her eyes distant, clung to Richard's hand as they walked down the main hallway. With each step, she grew more timid, more fearful, like the station's cold institutional setting was preventing her from relaxing. Their footsteps echoed in the corridors, turning this naturally rigid bureaucratic place into an intimidating environment for someone as vulnerable as she was. Richard, for his part, couldn't shake the eerie sense of déjà vu. He recalled his own childhood, when he too had found himself at the mercy of a system that offered neither warmth nor understanding. In one of the offices, they found Lily Morales, the district's assigned social worker. She was a dark-haired woman whose serious expression couldn't hide the sympathetic glow in her eyes. Spotting Luna, Lily softened her demeanor and invited her to sit in a small waiting area furnished with only a few worn chairs and a table covered in social services pamphlets. Gently, Lily offered her a glass of water and some cookies, trying to win the girl's trust. But each question she asked only made Luna withdraw further, barely uttering shy, indistinct murmurs. Richard and Julian stood close by, their presence calming her enough to stave off panic. Meanwhile, Richard spoke privately with Lily, explaining the situation in detail. He recounted how they had found Luna sleeping on the funeral home's doorstep, alone, clinging to her memory of her deceased mother. He described Mrs. Margaret, the funeral home's owner, and the devastating debts that threatened to prevent a dignified service for Luna's mother. Lily took careful notes, nodding quietly as she consulted an old, overstuffed case file. After listening intently, she tapped her pen against her lips, pondering. The most immediate solution, Lily said, would be placing Luna in a temporary shelter while we sort out custody. We can't leave her at the funeral home, especially now with her situation so uncertain. She isn't getting the care or supervision she needs. Richard noticed Luna tense up at the mention of a shelter. Even from a few meters away, he saw her tiny fists clench and heard her breathing grow shallow. It struck a chord in him. He understood her fear, having gone through something similar in his own childhood. He instinctively intervened, his voice reflecting more empathy than authority. I understand the concern, Lily, but if we send her to a shelter right now, we'd be taking her away from the only link she has left to her mother. She's scared, grieving, and the last thing she wants is to leave the funeral home, where she still feels close to her. Maybe there's another option while custody is sorted out and the funeral arrangements are made. Lily exhaled, running her hand across the folder of documents. Looking up, she replied with a firm yet compassionate tone. I get it, but we have to protect the child. Any irregularities or lack of supervision puts her at risk. The system has very strict protocols. It's not something we can change overnight. Before Richard could respond, the office door flung open. In walked Ernest Towers, the station chief, a tall, solid man with a penetrating gaze and a permanently furrowed brow. His footsteps thudded authoritatively across the floor as he crossed his arms, giving Richard a pointed look of frustration. Brown, why are you wasting your time on this? Ernest snapped, not even bothering with a greeting. We have more urgent cases to deal with than some kid sleeping on the street. This should be handled by the social worker, and if necessary, the juvenile courts. It's not the police's job to stick their noses into these things. The scornful tone and haughty demeanor of Ernest made Richard's blood boil. Still, he held back the urge to respond bluntly. He took a deep breath, remembering the fear he had seen in Luna's eyes, and did his best to keep calm as he reasoned. Chief, I'm asking for a little understanding. She's a minor with nowhere else to go. Her mother died just hours ago, and the funeral home is on the brink of bankruptcy. We can't just turn away. Our job is also to protect and serve the community, not just patrol the streets. Ernest clenched his jaw, glaring at Richard. It was clear he had no intention of budging. Sensing the tension in the air, Julian opted to remain silent, aware that any ill-chosen word might escalate the confrontation. Meanwhile, Luna shrank further into her seat, gripping Lily's hand as though she feared the world might swallow her at any moment. The police's responsibility is to maintain order, not get involved in personal dramas, Ernest continued, practically spitting out his words. If you want to do social work, Brown, do it on your own time. But don't put this station in an awkward position over a case that, let's face it, could be handled by the proper agencies. I'm ordering you to leave this to Lily and the juvenile court. End of story. A heavy silence descended, loaded with the chief's hostility. Richard took another deep breath, knowing any further argument could lead to serious trouble. Yet he couldn't turn his back on the child. Luna's story, her reluctance to leave her mother's side, resonated too strongly with his own memories. He refused to surrender her to a system that saw her as just another file. "I'll do my job, Chief," he finally said, his voice neutral though tinted with disappointment. "But I'll also do what's right. We all serve a purpose greater than filling out reports." Ernest narrowed his eyes, weighing Richard's words. After a few tense seconds, he turned on his heel without replying and left the office, leaving the door wide open. The echo of his footsteps faded down the hall, while a charged silence settled over those who remained. Lily stroked Luna's hair, trying to comfort her. Julian let out a slight sigh, as if he'd been holding his breath all along. And Richard, still gazing at the girl, felt his resolve grow stronger. Even if the system was sometimes cold and uncaring, he would not let Luna become entangled in its machinery without someone looking out for her. "We'll figure something out, Luna. You're not alone," he assured her, his voice quiet yet resolute. Lily closed the folder and looked at Richard with a mix of gratitude and concern. She knew his kindness could collide head-on with regulations. Still, she secretly admired that altruistic determination, the refusal to settle for mere protocol when a child's life was at stake. "We'll do what we can to find another way," she added, feeling Luna grip her hand tightly. "But you have to be aware there'll be hurdles." Richard nodded, accepting the reality of what they faced. He stood up and gently gestured for Luna to walk alongside him. Exiting the office, he realized this first confrontation with Ernest would not be the last. Yet the memory of the little girl's fear, her dread of being torn away from the only place that still bound her to her mother, was enough to keep Richard fighting. He was determined to do his part, even if it meant confronting an indifferent system and challenging rules that sometimes forgot the human side of justice. Several days later, the afternoon sun shone through the small break-room windows at the station, tracing bright lines across the floor. An atmosphere of pensive silence hung there, broken only by the soft hum of fluorescent lights. Seated next to Luna, Officer Richard Brown watched her cradle a cup of water in her hands. The girl was still visibly shaken, as though the fragile thread connecting her to the world depended on the empathy he offered. As for Richard, he tried to remain calm and protective, even as past memories surged through him like waves, memories he had thought were long buried. With a gentle gesture, Richard brushed Luna's hair aside. She looked up, and for the first time since he had met her, she gave a faint smile. Although sorrow still lingered in her eyes, there was a flicker of trust, a sign of the budding bond forming between them. "My mom always said hope was like a small light in the darkness," Luna whispered suddenly, running her fingers around the rim of the cup. "When I felt sad, she'd hug me and tell me a story about a star that got lost in the sky but kept shining anyway." Richard felt a lump in his throat. Hearing Luna talk about her mother brought back memories of his own childhood and the emptiness that settled into his heart the day he lost his. It was as if, through the girl's words, he was reliving those final moments he'd shared with his mother. He felt his compassion for Luna intertwine with the melancholy of his own story. "My mother talked to me about stars too," Richard admitted softly. She said that whenever someone we love goes away, their light transforms and keeps shining somewhere else, watching over the people they cared about. Luna lifted her gaze with curiosity. It surprised her to find that this serious, protective officer had gone through something so similar to what she was feeling now. It was like glimpsing a mirror that reflected not just her pain, but a sliver of hope. Richard noticed the spark of interest in the girl's eyes and hesitated, unsure if it was appropriate to share his personal story. But something inside him suggested that honesty might strengthen the trust growing between them. "When I was your age," he went on gently, "my mother got sick all of a sudden and couldn't get the treatment she needed. I didn't have anyone else, no relatives to take me in. When she passed away, I felt like my whole world had collapsed. I was overwhelmed by helplessness, and for a long time I thought the pain would never go away." Luna's eyes widened. She wanted to speak, but her lips quivered, making it impossible for the words to come out. Richard gave her arm a light squeeze, hoping to encourage her to voice her feelings. "What did you do?" she finally asked, her tone filled with longing, desperate to know how he had climbed out of that despair. Richard glanced toward the window, recalling the nights he spent in a cold waiting room or sleeping on a neighbor's couch when they took pity on him. He remembered the social worker who tried to help him back then, a decent person, but someone who couldn't provide the warmth and safety he longed for. Then he thought of his teenage years, how he channeled his anger and frustration until he found a path in the police force, driven by a desire to help others who were going through what he had endured. "It wasn't easy," he admitted, turning back to Luna. "There were times I felt very alone and trapped. But I found out there are good people out there willing to help. Over time, I found a place here, as an officer, so I could keep others from experiencing what I went through." A moment of silence followed, broken by the arrival of Julian, who approached cautiously, concern etched on his face. He looked at Luna, then at Richard, and, seeing the swirling emotions, chose to speak quietly so as not to disrupt the fragile intimacy of the moment. "Richard, can we talk for a second?" he asked, gesturing for him to step away. Richard glanced at Luna before standing up. "I'll be right back," he promised, and she nodded. In the hallway, Julian crossed his arms and leaned against the wall, searching for the right words. He knew Richard well enough to understand why he was so invested in Luna's case, but he also recognized that Ernest's stance and the police bureaucracy could put Richard in a difficult position. "Look, buddy," Julian began cautiously, "I totally get why you're doing this. It's obvious that seeing Luna stirs up memories you'd rather keep in the past. But you also know how things work around here. Ernest isn't going to let this drop so easily, and you could end up in real trouble." Richard nodded, feeling the weight of his responsibilities on his shoulders. Every time he thought about the possibility of abandoning Luna, his conscience throbbed with guilt. "I know, Julian," he replied, pressing his back against the wall. "But I can't leave her alone, not after everything that's happened. I don't want her to experience the same hopelessness I felt when I lost my mother." Julian closed his eyes for a moment, understanding Richard's dilemma. He had witnessed countless times how Richard would stand up for people who needed help, even if it meant working extra hours without recognition. Still, as his partner, he also felt responsible for making sure Richard didn't throw his career away on a burst of noble intentions. "Just be careful," Julian added, his concern evident. "There are ways to help Luna without taking on the entire system head-on. We could reach out to external organizations or talk with Lily more thoroughly to explore formal options." Richard placed a grateful hand on Julian's shoulder. Despite their differing personalities, he appreciated his partner's pragmatism, as it helped him keep things in perspective. "Thanks, really," he replied with a half-smile. "Just promise that if things get tough, you'll help me figure out how to move forward." Julian nodded, returning the smile. They walked back together to the break room, where Luna waited, absently playing with her nearly empty cup of water. Seeing both officers return, she let out what seemed like a small sigh of relief. At her young age, She already grasped that they were her only lifeline protecting her from an uncertain future. Richard sat back down beside Luna and, in a calmer voice, invited her to share another story about her mother. Luna recalled how Sophia, juggling 2 jobs, still managed to take her to an amusement park for her birthday. She described the shrieks of excitement on the roller coaster, the laughter they shared over ice cream, and the hug that seemed to last forever when the day came to an end. Each word was like a beacon of light piercing the darkness of her loss. Julian, standing a bit off to the side, felt moved by the bond that was forming between them. He also noticed the look of determination on Richard's face, that spark of conviction that said he would not back down. He knew that for Richard, protecting Luna wasn't just a matter of following police protocol, but rather a personal quest for justice, to spare her the abandonment that had left a permanent mark on his own life. Thus, in that sunlit room, a silent pact was forged. Feeling heard and valued, Luna opened her heart. By reliving the ghosts of his own past, Richard resolved not to let the girl's pain go unsupported. Julian, aware of the deeper emotions at play, prepared to back his friend in a struggle that, in a way, belonged to them both. From that moment on, the bond uniting them transcended official paperwork and the uniform's demands. They entered a distinctly human sphere, where moral duty blended with the urgency of protecting a life in a state of extreme vulnerability. Early morning efforts. The first hours of the morning passed relatively quietly at the station, though a mixture of anxiety and cautious hope hung in the air. Richard Brown and Julian had stayed up late the night before, mapping out a plan to help Luna and Mrs. Margaret cover the funeral costs. Even knowing that Ernest, the station chief, was watching them with suspicion, they refused to abandon the girl to her fate. They were determined to prove that, with a collective effort, a case so many deemed unimportant could still be resolved successfully. At daybreak, Richard headed outside to speak with neighbors and local shopkeepers. Their first goal was to organize a collection that would at least cover the minimal expenses Mrs. Margaret needed to provide Luna's mother with a dignified wake. It meant going door to door around the neighborhood, explaining the situation and appealing to people's compassion. Julian joined him for the first few hours, while Lily took care of administrative tasks for Luna back at the station. The response they received was mixed. Some were willing to help, remembering how Martinez Funeral Home had provided honest, caring service when their own friends or relatives passed away. Individuals like Senora Raquel, who ran a small grocery store, were visibly moved by Luna's story. She agreed not only to donate a portion of her week's earnings, but also to spread the word among other shopkeepers in the area. On the flip side, they encountered cold, skeptical reactions. Some business owners, having faced local crime or feeling suspicious of charity requests, assumed it was a scam or simply insisted they already had their own financial worries. More than once, Richard and Julian walked away from a closed door without a single coin, yet they took comfort in seeing how, at other stops, small contributions gradually added up. Meanwhile, Lily Morales began to shift her perspective on the case. Initially, she had been stiff and focused on adhering strictly to procedure, but Luna's determination not to leave the place where her mother lay, coupled with Richard's evident empathy, made her question the usual protocol. So, while the officers were out collecting donations, Lily started digging through archives and databases in hopes of finding any of Luna's relatives who could assume legal custody. This measure, which at first was just standard procedure, led her to a possible name: Beatrice, the girl's aunt. Discovering that clue, Lily tried calling the phone number on file, though it was several years out of date. It took a while before anyone answered, but when she finally spoke to the woman, it was clear convincing her to take responsibility for Luna wouldn't be easy. Still, Lily managed to arrange a meeting so Beatrice could sit down with the girl and the officers to discuss some possible family arrangement. By late afternoon, Richard and Julian returned to the station with a small donation box containing crumpled bills and loose change, just a first step toward their goal, but also tangible proof of the solidarity some neighbors were willing to offer. Exhausted, Richard dropped into a chair next to Lily's desk noticing a spark of enthusiasm in her eyes. "I found Luna's aunt," Lily announced, looking up from her papers. "Her name is Beatrice, and she's agreed to come by tonight. She wants to talk with us before making any decisions." Richard allowed himself a small, relieved smile, glad to learn the girl still had living family who might give her a more stable future. Yet he suspected it wouldn't be straightforward. Meanwhile, Luna had stayed with Julian in the break room, dozing off with her head on the table, worn out by the day's efforts. It was exhausting for a child to retell the trauma of her mother's death every time someone asked why they were collecting funds. At 8 o'clock that evening, a dark-haired woman with a tense demeanor and wary eyes stepped through the station doors. Lily went to meet her and guided her into the office where Richard and Luna were waiting. The moment Luna spotted Beatrice, she straightened up, trying to focus on her aunt. The woman's expression showed a mix of guilt, exhaustion, and reluctance. "Good evening," Beatrice said, folding her arms across her chest. She looked defensive, as though afraid of being judged. "Sorry I'm late. I got off work late and had to grab a taxi." Richard sensed it would be challenging to have an open dialogue. Nevertheless, he calmly offered her a seat and gave a brief rundown of Luna's situation. Her mother Sophia's recent death, the absence of other close relatives, and the fact that someone needed to assume guardianship. Beatrice sighed, avoiding Luna's gaze. Clearly, complicated feelings, possibly long-standing resentments or personal problems, had led her away from any supportive family role. At last, she spoke in a hushed voice. "It's not that I don't want to help my niece, but my life is complicated. I barely earn enough to feed my 2 kids, and my husband is out of work. The last time I saw Sophia was years ago, and it didn't end well. I'm sorry, but I can't take custody of Luna." The room fell silent. Luna lowered her head, pressing her lips together to hold back tears. Richard's heart clenched at the sight of the child's reaction, but he kept his composure and spoke with empathy. "We understand your situation, Beatrice," he said calmly, "but we need to find a way to ensure Luna isn't left defenseless. She's your niece, and by law, you're her closest relative." Beatrice avoided eye contact, shifting uneasily in her seat. "I know, officer. Believe me, it hurts me to see her like this, but I don't have the money. Taking her in would be another expense I just can't handle. I don't want her to go hungry or be deprived of a decent life." Lily, who had been quiet until then, spoke up to help move the conversation along. "Ms. Beatrice, there are support programs and government aid for situations like this. We could look into possibilities, for example, a temporary subsidy. However, before any of that, we need to know if you're willing to cooperate. If not, we'll have to proceed a different way." The woman took a deep breath, looking sadly at Luna, whose eyes were brimming with tears. A couple of seconds later, she stood up, brushing off her clothes as though trying to rid herself of invisible dust. "I'll do whatever's necessary. But I can't promise anything," she murmured, her voice almost stifled. "Maybe if that subsidy exists and we can work something out, I'll consider it. But right now, I can't take her home." With that, Beatrice said her goodbyes and left, leaving a cloud of uncertainty hanging in the room. Luna, devastated, didn't dare call after her. Fear of rejection and the pain of feeling abandoned by a relative paralyzed her. Richard and Lily exchanged anxious looks, fully aware that the aunt's answer wasn't what they'd hoped for, but neither did they want to push her so hard that she closed the door on them completely. When Beatrice was gone, Richard stepped closer to Luna, who was still seated, head down and trembling hands. He placed a hand on her shoulder and gently encouraged her to stand. Right then, Julian entered, carrying the small box of donations which, though modest, represented a glimmer of change. "Remember, you're not alone in this," Richard whispered, hoping to give her a trace of hope. "We'll keep looking for ways to help you, and I'm sure you'll soon be able to say goodbye to your mother the way she deserves." Although Luna's aunt wasn't ready to take responsibility, those first efforts at fundraising and Lily's new outlook hinted at a possible path towards solidarity. With the little donation box in hand and determination etched on their faces, Richard and Julian knew their mission was more than a routine procedure. Perhaps, after all, the entire neighborhood and certain institutions would show the humanity that was so needed at this time. Luna, her heart aching, clung to the silent promise that she wouldn't be abandoned, while the echo of the door closing behind Beatrice reminded them that the real hurdles were only beginning. Dawn was still wrapping the city in darkness when Lily Morales began to review the latest documents she had on Luna's case. Even though she felt drained from the extra hours she'd worked, she couldn't ignore the determination she'd seen in Richard and in the child herself over these recent days. Something about Luna's story touched her deeply, pushing her to seek solutions that went beyond her normal duties as a social worker. That was how, amid old files and dusty records, she stumbled upon a name that echoed powerfully. Fabian, potentially the girl's father. Lily didn't have much information on him. There were only vague references in an old hospital report, along with a partial address for the neighborhood where Luna had lived with her mother. Still, uncovering even that small lead meant there was a chance to find someone legally responsible for the child, or at least someone who could help cover Sophia's funeral expenses. Sipping on her cold coffee, Lily decided to start the formal search for Fabian, however complicated it might be to get his full details. The next morning, Richard and Julian showed up on time at the station. There was tension in the air, as both knew Ernest Towers remained suspicious of them for insisting on helping Luna. But they weren't about to abandon the cause. When Lily told them about Fabian, they exchanged looks of surprise and concern. "Do you think he's really still around here?" Julian asked, adjusting his duty belt. "I can't be sure," Lily replied, showing them the thin file. "But it's the only lead we've got right now. If he's alive and in this area, we're obligated to notify him that he has a daughter in a vulnerable situation." Richard frowned as he nodded. Until that moment, the total absence of any father figure had weighed heavily on Luna's situation. Even mentioning the possibility of his return might disrupt her fragile emotional balance. Indeed, when Luna found out someone had uttered her father's name, she was torn between curiosity and a bottled-up anger she didn't know how to express. "Why was he never with us?" she asked in almost a whisper, while Richard accompanied her to a corner of the waiting area. "Mom said he abandoned us, left without looking back. Why should I care about him now?" Richard knelt so he could look into her eyes and gently took her hands. "I don't know, Luna. Sometimes people make mistakes, and over time they realize they need to set things right. It doesn't mean you have to forgive him immediately or welcome him with open arms. I only want you to know you deserve all the explanations in the world." The girl listened to him with a serious expression, blinking away tears of mingled rage and pain. On one hand, the possibility of having a father around reopened a chapter her mother Sophia had left unfinished. On the other, she dreaded more disappointment if this man turned out to be as indifferent as he'd seemed all these years. Meanwhile, the paperwork concerning the funeral home kept getting more complex. The promised charitable funds had been delayed, partly due to bureaucratic procedures, partly because of Mrs. Margaret's mounting debts at Martinez Funeral Home. The initial pledges of assistance got tangled in endless forms and requirements nobody seemed capable of meeting on time. Frustrated, Richard and Julian organized additional rounds through the neighborhood, seeking more donations and once again explaining the urgency of the situation. "It's unbelievable how many roadblocks show up when a poor family tries to give a loved one a proper farewell," Julian remarked as they headed to a butcher shop whose owner had shown some empathy. "We could be at this for weeks if we rely solely on official channels." Richard nodded, feeling fatigue creep over him. Still, when he thought about Luna's face and how she clung to the hope of granting her mother a worthy goodbye, he found the strength to keep going. He was used to fighting indifference, but this time, the cause touched him on a far more personal level. For her part, Lily kept making calls and digging through records, hoping to find Fabian, or at least someone who had seen him. She managed to speak to a couple of neighbors who vaguely remembered a man by that name, but they weren't certain of his whereabouts. Even so, that slight confirmation was enough for Lily to widen her search. News that Luna's father might be in the area spread quickly. At the funeral home, Mrs. Margaret fretted over how Fabian's involvement might affect the debt payment. Meanwhile, some folks in the community reacted with caution and suspicion. More than a few believed that if Fabian had ignored the child and Sophia all this time, he wasn't likely to be much help now. As for Luna, she kept her deepest thoughts to herself. The mix of anger and hope she felt at the possibility of Fabian's return weighed heavily on her. Though she wasn't prepared to forgive him easily, she couldn't deny that she had often dreamed about having the father she had never known. Perceiving her inner turmoil, Richard tried to stay close, listening without judgment. "If he shows up and wants to take me with him, will I have to go?" Luna asked one afternoon, her voice trembling as though her whole future hinged on the answer. "By law, he's your biological father, but nothing gets decided overnight," Richard explained calmly. "What really matters is that you're safe and have what you need. Nobody can force you to do anything you don't want, at least not without a legal process to back it up." The girl closed her eyes and sighed, struggling to absorb what she had just heard. Memories of her mother flashed through her mind, stories about how she met Fabian and the reasons he left. Each detail brought more tension, more fear of another abandonment, or worse, that this man might show up just to complicate Sophia's burial instead of helping. Thus passed the days, marked by uncertainty. Fundraising continued with ups and downs. The charitable aid paperwork was still pending approval, and Lily kept searching for leads to officially locate Fabian. Every step seemed to spawn more questions than answers. However, despite the difficulties, Richard, Julian, and Lily agreed on one thing. They would do everything possible to give Luna the chance to close the most painful chapter of her life with dignity. Even though the shadow of that unknown father loomed over her future, as well as their efforts to carry out her mother's final farewell. Morning broke heavily over the neighborhood, as if uncertainty had settled into every corner. The phone at Martinez funeral home rang just as the first rays of sun filtered through dusty windows. Mrs. Margaret, frowning and sporting dark circles from too many sleepless nights, answered the call, hoping for good news. But when she heard the curt voice on the other end, her hands began to tremble. It was the bank manager, informing her that the deadline to pay off the debt would expire in 48 hours. If she failed to make a substantial payment on the past due interest, the funeral home would be repossessed with no recourse. A lump formed in Mrs. Margaret's throat as she hung up, painfully aware that her entire life and those of the many vulnerable families relying on her services now hung by a thread. To this point, the donations Richard and Julian had gathered, along with the funeral home's meager resources, weren't enough to stop the imminent blow. They were far from the amount demanded. Meanwhile, the atmosphere at the station was no less strained. Ernest Towers, the chief, summoned Richard to his office at first light. The moment he walked in, the agent caught sight of his superior's stern expression and knew the conversation wouldn't be pleasant. With an impatient gesture, Ernest tossed a file onto the desk. "Brown," he growled, "here are the pending reports on robberies in the upper part of the city. Yet I hear you're still wasting your time, and the station's resources, on that business with the little girl and the funeral home. Does that strike you as appropriate?" Richard stood firm, despite his racing pulse. He knew Ernest had no interest in sympathizing with Luna's story. Still, he appealed to his sense of duty. "Chief, I understand the priority of the robbery cases, but Luna's situation is urgent. She's alone, she's got nowhere to go, and the funeral home holding her mother's body could shut down if the debts aren't settled." Ernest raised his voice, clearly annoyed. "That's not the police's concern. Our responsibility is to maintain order and follow up on crimes. The rest falls to social services or whoever else. I'm warning you now, if you keep getting personally involved, I'll open a disciplinary file. We're not risking the station's reputation over sentimental issues." Richard gritted his teeth to avoid snapping back. He simply nodded, knowing that pushing harder could ruin everything he'd worked for. Exiting the office, He ran into Julian, who eyed him worriedly. "Everything all right?" Julian asked, noticing his partner's tense demeanor. "We need to hurry. The chief made it clear he won't tolerate any more distractions involving Luna," Richard said with a sigh. Even so, he had no intention of giving up. Hours later, Lily Morales arrived with new information that ratcheted up the tension. Confirmation that Luna's father, Fabian, had unofficially appeared in the neighborhood. Apparently, someone spotted him lurking around the funeral home, though he didn't dare go inside. The news reached the station, and Lily prepared to search for him formally to clarify the child's legal situation. When Luna heard her father was nearby, she was swept up in a maelstrom of emotions. On one hand, the idea of meeting this stranger who had been absent her entire life filled her with anger and confusion. On the other, she feared his sudden appearance might force her out of the funeral home before she could properly say goodbye to her mother. With the bank debt threatening to destroy the place and Lily pushing to settle custody, Luna felt as if her world were collapsing around her. The child was sitting in the waiting area, staring teary-eyed at the office door where Julian and Lily were talking, when she overheard a whisper that stopped her cold. Someone mentioned Fabian's name quietly. She didn't catch the whole sentence, but gathered that he might come to the station to sign some papers. Panic seized her in an instant. Without another thought, she got up and ran out, ignoring the startled looks of several officers. She ran and ran until her legs gave out. She only stopped when she reached a deserted street, feeling lost and breathless. Trembling with each ragged inhalation, she pictured Fabian claiming her, taking her away from the funeral home while her mother's body remained there, unvisited. The mere thought terrified her, as her mind clung to the promise never to leave her mother alone. Meanwhile, back at the station, Richard realized Luna was missing and panicked. Julian, equally alarmed, started asking co-workers if they'd seen her leave. One officer mentioned that the girl had dashed out, but had no idea where she was headed. Without hesitation, Richard grabbed his car keys and rushed off, determined to find her before anything worse could happen. Behind the wheel, he recalled how he himself had felt a similar desperation as a child, that piercing loneliness that drove him to run away from everything whenever the world closed in on him. Now Luna was caught in that same emotional bind, and he wasn't about to let the darkness consume her. He drove along the surrounding streets, checking alleys and parks, until he finally spotted her sitting on the edge of a curb, hugging her knees. "Luna," he murmured, approaching carefully, worried he might startle her. Kneeling to her level, he added, "We've been looking everywhere for you. Are you all right?" Luna didn't respond at first. She just let out a broken sigh. Then, as if the words had been stuck in her throat, she opened her mouth and let out a silent sob. Julian offered her a bottle of water, and Richard rested a gentle hand on her shoulder. "I didn't mean to bother you," the child managed to say, "but I got scared they'd take me away from my mom. I was afraid that if my father showed up, they could force me to go with him." Richard took a breath, trying his best to comfort her. "No one will make you do anything without us talking it through first. And until then, I won't let anything bad happen to you. I promise." Julian nodded, reaffirming his unconditional support. Together, they helped her stand and walked her back to the neighborhood. On the way, Luna talked about her memories of her mother, how she took her to that same hospital whenever she was sick, and how, despite her pain, she managed to give her one last smile. Richard and Julian exchanged sympathetic looks, impressed by how strong this little girl was, in spite of her age. When they got to the station, they were greeted by an unexpected sight. Several neighbors had decided to wait for Luna to show their support. They were gathered at the entrance, holding makeshift signs with words of encouragement. Among them were Senora Raquel, owner of the tiny grocery store, and Tomas, the butcher, who had always been a leading voice in the community. After learning about the situation, they wanted to offer more than scattered donations. "We've been talking," Raquel said, walking up with a determined stride, "and we think we can organize food sales and charity raffles to help the funeral home. It's not much." But every little bit helps. Tomas nodded, proudly holding up a flyer he'd printed in a hurry. We're planning on setting up a street fair this weekend. We believe the whole neighborhood will pitch in. Everyone knows Mrs. Margaret. She's always helped our families when we needed it most. This show of solidarity moved Luna so much, she couldn't help a faint smile. For the first time since her mother passed away, she felt she wasn't alone in the chaos. Richard watched the scene, his heart swelling with gratitude, realizing that his persistence hadn't been in vain. Julian, by his side, looked at the neighbors with a mix of joy and relief, aware that if they wanted to save the funeral home and help Luna, they needed a stronger force than just official resources. As the community got organized, Lily Morales seized the momentum and activated her network of contacts. She picked up the phone and called various agencies to speed up any pending paperwork that would let Sophia's funeral proceed without further delay. She knew time was short and that the bank demanded payment in a matter of hours. If they couldn't halt foreclosure, the funeral home would shut down, taking with it the only chance Luna had to give her mother a proper send-off. Over the next few hours, the neighborhood turned into a hive of activity. Some residents spent their time cooking huge pots of stews and homemade dishes to sell at an impromptu street festival. Others volunteered to set up raffles, collect donated goods, and organize auctions to benefit the funeral home. The streets were adorned with posters and banners announcing the events, while volunteers went door to door explaining the urgency of the situation. Despite the tension and Ernest's threats to open a disciplinary file against Richard, the officer kept supporting the movement. At every corner, he came across faces that showed a genuine desire to help. Little by little, the donation box began to fill with bills and coins, providing a fresh glimmer of hope. Even then, there was still a long way to go before reaching the bank's required amount. Meanwhile, Luna stayed near Lily, helping hand out flyers advertising the charity events. Though still shy, she was warmed by those who came over to give her a hug or a few comforting words. Her mother's memory remained a burden on her heart, but seeing strangers come together to honor Sophia's legacy offered her some small solace. By nightfall, the station had turned into an improvised logistics hub. Dozens of people came and went, dropping off donations or receiving instructions about the next day's tasks. Richard oversaw security to keep things orderly, while Julian took charge of carefully counting every contribution to keep transparent records. Lily, for her part, was on the phone non-stop, telling Mrs. Margaret which forms she needed to sign and how much time they had to make a partial payment on the debt. It was all a hectic back and forth, yet infused with the positive energy only solidarity can create. That night, Luna stayed in the station's break room, accompanied by Lily and Richard. Exhaustion claimed her early, and she fell asleep under a blanket someone had lent her. While she slept, the others kept working quietly. Each knew it wasn't just about saving the funeral home. It was about proving that even in adversity, a united neighborhood could make the impossible happen. After midnight, a starry sky settled over the city, bathing it in a moment of calm. Inside the station, the murmur of voices and the tapping of phones receded. Yet there was a palpable sense that something big was taking shape. The collective resolve hinted that maybe, just maybe, Luna would be able to give her mother the farewell she so dearly wanted, and in doing so, find a more stable refuge for her uncertain future. Beneath those stars, the neighborhood no longer felt like scattered individuals, but like a single heartbeat, pulsing powerfully against the shadows of hardship. The next day began under the lingering echoes of the hustle and bustle the neighborhood had unleashed the night before. Neighbors had come together as never before to raise the funds Mrs. Margaret's funeral home so desperately needed, and though they still hadn't reached the total amount the bank demanded, hope could be felt on every corner. Luna finally got some rest after a long day of raffles, street fairs, and contributions. However, her peace would be short-lived, as a new challenge loomed over her: the potential arrival of her father, Fabian. At first light, social worker Lily Morales showed up at the station looking more somber than usual. After another night of research, She'd unearthed documents and statements from people around the neighborhood, confirming that Fabian not only had serious debts, but had never supported Luna's well-being or shown the slightest concern for her. The records painted a grim picture, proving he'd been absent for years and now, suddenly, claimed parental rights without any moral or financial basis to do so. Meanwhile, Richard Brown prepared to accompany Luna to Mrs. Margaret's funeral home. Despite pressure from Ernest, the station chief, who kept insisting he stop wasting time, Richard had promised the child he wouldn't give up until her mother received the dignified farewell she deserved. There, among the caskets and flowers awaiting better days, the most tense confrontation of this entire story was about to take place. By midday, while Mrs. Margaret was frantically counting how much money they still needed to fend off repossession, a tall, disheveled man appeared in the funeral home's doorway. His expression was haughty, his attitude somewhat confrontational. Luna recognized him right away, not because she'd seen him before, but because of the hollow sensation radiating from his presence. He was Fabian, her biological father, who walked in without a greeting, his voice abrupt. "I'm here for my daughter," he declared firmly, first eyeing Mrs. Margaret, then Richard. "They told me at the station she's here and that her mother died. I've got the right to take her with me." Richard felt an inner heat stir his blood. He had heard enough bits and pieces about Fabian to know he wasn't trustworthy and had never been part of Luna's life. Still, as a police officer, he had to remain composed. He stepped forward, keeping his cool. "Please calm down, sir," he requested in a firm tone. "I understand you're Luna's father, but she's going through a very sensitive time. Let's at least try to talk this through." Fabian snorted, unwilling to discuss anything calmly. "Talk it through?" he scoffed. "I came here to take charge of my daughter. Besides, I can handle the funeral arrangements for her mother right now, as long as you let me have the girl. I'm her father. Nobody can stop me." Lily, who had arrived a few minutes earlier carrying a folder of documents and receipts, raised her voice. Surprisingly, it sounded calm, though her words were laden with facts. "Mr. Fabian," she began, stepping closer, "I understand you haven't contributed anything to Luna's support. I have documents here showing you never filed her birth certificate, never made any financial contributions, and, as far as we know, you've been wandering around in serious debt. On what basis do you now claim the right to take her with you?" Fabian hesitated for a moment. He blinked nervously, clearly uneasy at the mention of his debts. Still, he quickly recovered and tried to act indifferent. "That's none of your business," he retorted with a shrug. "She's my daughter, not your problem. Or is it that you people want to keep her for your own gain?" Confronted by such an absurd accusation, Richard frowned. Luna, who had been standing aside during the conversation, stepped out from behind a counter where she'd been hiding. Fear and anger both shone on her face, revealing the turmoil within. "Why do you say you'll immediately arrange my mum's funeral?" the child asked, her voice trembling. "You don't even know who she really was. Where were you all this time?" Taken aback to see her there, Fabian tried to move closer, but Luna retreated a step. He raised his hand in a conciliatory gesture. "Listen, daughter, I know I've been gone, but I had complications. I've come to help you, believe me," he insisted, the sincerity in his tone sounding forced, almost avoiding her eyes. Mrs. Margaret said nothing, observing the scene with a lump in her throat. She knew that if Fabian took Luna away from the funeral home, they'd lose one of the key moral supports they'd leaned on these past days. She also sensed that his promise of a quick burial came from a purely opportunistic motive, maybe hoping to gain some financial benefit. Lily took a step forward and fixed her gaze on Fabian. "If you truly want to help, sir, prove it through legitimate means. You don't fix this by bargaining with your daughter's grief. There are legal steps to follow, but most of all, this is about care and responsibility. Luna has lived her entire life without you. Before demanding to take her away, you should get to know her, find out what she really needs, and respect her decisions." Richard sensed the mounting tension, like a current in the air poised to spark a physical confrontation. He intervened before things could escalate. "Fabian, you heard Lily. If you want to help, do it openly. Pitching in for the funeral and showing real interest in Luna would be a good start. But talking about burying her mother right away, if she goes with you, sounds more like blackmail than genuine concern." Fabian's breathing quickened, his fists clenching in anger. He seemed torn between lashing out violently and walking away. Then Luna, tears streaming and her voice trembling, spoke without hesitation. "You know nothing about me," she stated, meeting his gaze. "You weren't there when I got sick. You never showed up on my birthday, and you disappeared when Mom lost her job. Now you come in here, promising some fast burial for her. Why would I care about anything you offer if you don't even know who I am?" A heavy silence followed Luna's words. Fabian, unable to keep looking at her, let out a frustrated snort. He made as if to leave, pausing only to mumble a final defense. "If that's the scorn you all have for me, then it's your problem. I'm her father, and sooner or later, the law will take my side." With that, he turned and stormed out of the funeral home, leaving behind a charged air of tension and lingering questions about his true intentions. When the sound of his footsteps faded, Luna slumped her shoulders as though relieved of an immense weight. Richard approached and gently laid a hand on her shoulder, while Lily tucked away the documents proving Fabian had never contributed to the girl's upbringing. "I'm sorry, Luna," Richard muttered. "I wish this had been different for you." Shaking her head, Luna wiped her tears with her coat sleeve. "It's okay. I've realized he's not here because he actually cares," she said, sounding more grown-up than anyone expected. "He just wants to gain something out of all this. Mom would never have wanted it to be like this." Mrs. Margaret let out a sigh that blended relief and worry. She knew that even though the confrontation was over, its repercussions would linger. Luna's father had made it plain he wouldn't hesitate to seek legal rights, and no one could promise he wouldn't come back with a lawyer to fight for custody. Yet in Luna's eyes, there was a new clarity, an understanding that love can't be begged for, and after all that pain, she wouldn't bow to a father figure who only turned up for personal gain. Through a swirl of conflicting emotions, Richard and Lily exchanged a knowing glance. Luna's situation called for a permanent and safe resolution. With Fabian dismissed as a reliable option, the child's immediate future was still uncharted. But for now, at least, they had thwarted the opportunistic plans of an absent father. And though the funeral still hung in the balance, financially and legally, Luna finally felt her voice and feelings were being heard. In every corner of the funeral home, her mother's memory endured. And with the steadfast support of the community around her, the girl understood that real family was built on sincere love, not on hollow promises. Morning broke with a gentle light, as though the sun knew to shine with extra delicacy. After multiple days of tireless work, the community had collected enough money to cover the funeral expenses for Sophia, Luna's mother, and to meet the bank's most urgent demands at Mrs. Margaret's funeral home. It was a collective effort uniting neighbors, local shopkeepers, and even strangers who'd been moved by the story and wanted to help through donations, raffles, or charity events. The anxiety over impending foreclosure gave way to cautious optimism when Mrs. Margaret got a call from the bank manager confirming that, thanks to the recent payments and a new agreement, the funeral home would not be repossessed. Even though the debts wouldn't vanish entirely, this arrangement gave her enough time and stability to keep her business running. After ending the call, she burst into tears of relief, hugging Richard and Julian when they came by. Meanwhile, social worker Lily Morales was finalizing the legal paperwork to hold Sophia's funeral at the same funeral home. For Luna, it was crucial to say goodbye to her mother in the place where she had guarded her so fiercely and lovingly without feeling pushed out prematurely. With the documents in order and the green light granted, the ceremony was scheduled for that very afternoon. The coffin was placed in the funeral home's small chapel, adorned with modest yet carefully arranged flowers from some of the neighbors. A bouquet of white lilies and pink carnations donated by the local florist, took center stage. Nearby stood a photo of Sophia, smiling gently, reflecting her resilient spirit. Luna approached in silence, running her fingertips over the picture as she recalled her mother's laughter and how she would rock her to sleep. The ceremony was simple. There were no grand speeches or lavish displays, but the shared emotion was profound. Neighbors like Senora Raquel and Tomas, the butcher, took seats off to the side, there to support Luna in her farewell. Even some who had never met Sophia stopped by, touched by the girl's sorrow and thankful for the chance to lend a hand in such a human cause. Richard and Julian remained close to Luna, prepared to help in any way. More than once, she reached for Richard's hand, clinging tight as tears streamed uncontrollably down her cheeks. When the service ended, several neighbors took turns embracing her and offering words of comfort. Never before had Luna felt so supported. The warmth of those people, united by tragedy, dispelled the anguish that had haunted her for days. Fabian did not show up, and in fact, by the end of the ceremony, Lily announced that, given the proof of his financial instability and lack of genuine concern for Luna, a judge had officially excluded him from any temporary custodial rights. The social worker's documents, along with testimonies from neighbors and Luna herself, showed that the man was merely seeking personal gain and was in no condition to care for his daughter. For Luna, this was a relief. She no longer feared being forced to leave with someone who had never bothered to learn who she really was. Ernest Towers, the chief of the precinct, arrived in an official capacity. He wore a serious, almost contemplative expression, aware that the neighborhood's mobilization and growing media interest had actually generated positive publicity for the police, and by extension for him. Although he had initially threatened Richard with a disciplinary file, he now recognized it would be counterproductive to penalize the officer when he had so much community support. Hearing all the praising comments, Ernest finally relented. "Brown, I guess your determination turned out to be more helpful than I thought," he remarked softly, walking alongside Richard at the end of the ceremony. "If people trust you, it also benefits the station. I'll consider your request for temporary guardianship of the girl." Richard noted in Ernest's words a mix of resignation and pragmatism, but he didn't miss the chance he had been waiting for. He thanked him with a slight nod and prepared to take the next step, officially applying to take Luna in while her situation was resolved. He understood it wouldn't happen overnight or be free of red tape, but at least he had his superior's consent. That very day, Lily accompanied Richard and Luna to a family court judge who, after reviewing paperwork and briefly interviewing them both, allowed the provisional guardianship process to begin. The judge based his decision on the need to keep the girl from being left without care, as well as on the clear emotional connection between Luna and the officer. Conditions were set for periodic follow-ups, regular evaluations, and a time frame for social services to assess the feasibility of permanent guardianship or adoption, depending on how events unfolded. With that part underway, Mrs. Margaret's funeral home was able to open its doors the next day with a fresh atmosphere. Freed from the immediate threat of foreclosure, she resumed her work with the same compassion she always gave to those mourning a loved one. On the door, a humble sign reading, "Thank you for supporting this place," served as a reminder of the solidarity that had saved the business, and at the same time protected the dignity of a funeral that marked a before and after for the whole neighborhood. By nightfall, Richard and Luna made their way home. It had been a long day, laden with emotion. The child, exhausted, went upstairs to the room Richard had set up with whatever he had on hand: clean sheets, a small desk, and a simple lamp. Before going to bed, Luna paused in the doorway, taking in the space that, from that moment on, would become her temporary refuge. "Thank you, Richard," she murmured, her voice trembling slightly. "I thought I'd never feel safe again after everything that happened with my mom." He answered with a sincere smile, recognizing in his own eyes the child he once was, the one who had desperately longed for a place to call home after losing his mother. He came closer and gently ruffled the girl's hair. "This is your home too. For as long as you need it, Luna. Don't forget that. Closing the door behind her, Richard lay down on the couch, replaying in his mind everything they had been through over the past days. He recalled the night he found Luna sleeping outside the funeral home, and how strangers had rallied together so she wouldn't be left alone. He also remembered Fabian's threatening stance and the sudden change in Ernest, who had ended up recognizing his officer's true worth. He felt exhausted, yet fulfilled. Yes, he had done his official duty, but he had also taken on something far greater. In that instant, he understood that sometimes one act of empathy and determination is all it takes to ignite solidarity in an entire community. Above all, he realized that genuine justice isn't just about regulations and procedures, it's about warmth and genuine protection for those who need it most. That thought stayed with him until fatigue finally overcame him. As he drifted off, he imagined the soft sound of Luna's footsteps in the hallway. He pictured her tucked in bed, maybe holding onto her mother's memory, but at last certain she wasn't alone. In this way, the night closed the most painful chapter of her story, opening the door to a tomorrow where sadness might transform into strength and abandonment into a new home. This story reminds us that sometimes the hardest trials can awaken the deepest sense of humanity in those around us. When Luna clung to her mother's memory, she found not only unexpected support from Richard and Julian, but also sparked solidarity in an entire neighborhood. The commitment of each neighbor, along with the determination of people like Lily and Mrs. Margaret, showed that real family isn't always defined by blood, but by empathy and a desire to help without expecting anything in return. Meanwhile, Luna's courage in facing her loss and Richard's dedication to ensure the girl didn't grow up with the same emptiness he had once endured teach us that a single act of kindness can change many lives. With the neighborhood behind them, loneliness turned into company, uncertainty gave way to hope, and a simple act of compassion became the foundation for a new beginning. And that's where our story ends. Thank you so much for reading all the way to the end. Don't forget to leave a like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more content. I'll see you next time. Take care and keep the spark of hope alive.